I think we're about to start. I'm Mordechai Cohen, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the second meeting of the Chinese-Jewish Conversation at Yeshiva University. Da Jia Hao, Wan Shang Hao, Wo Shi Kong Mu Ren. 今天我们是第二次开会，中国人和犹太人之间的对话。We're privileged this evening to hear from Professor Roger Ames of Beijing, a world scholar of Confucian thought. We're deeply grateful to Professor Ames and his wife Bonnie for making the trip all the way from Beijing to be with us this evening. They did so out of a fervent belief that the ancient Chinese traditions are relevant today, certainly something that resonates with Jewish people. We're grateful to the sponsors of this event, the Provost's Faculty Colloquium, the Katz School of Science and Health, and the Bernard Revel Graduate School of Jewish Studies, where I serve as Associate Dean. A special thanks to all of those who've invested many hours to make tonight's event successful, especially Sarah Reinitz, Rona Steinerman, and Malka Lubavik. Could you guys... Thank you. Those three young ladies got texts from me late at night, early in the morning, and throughout every day. They made sure this room was set up, the PowerPoint works, had to check, and that the dumplings and sushi were here, and there are very few left, so we ordered just the right amount. And they prepared all of the flyers, the online invitations, and the written material on your seats. So pay attention. Everything there is really top-notch due to their assistance. Now, that's our Jewish team. We also want to acknowledge our dedicated Chinese team who've worked with me on the Chinese correspondence and Chinese signage and the Chinese messages. They also got texts from me late at night and early in the morning, and they answered me on the WeChat, of course, Weixin, our Chinese WhatsApp. Wang Yunxiang is president of the YU Student Union, and he was with us earlier today. Shang Guanshun assisted me with this project from day one, and Huang He, professor of accounting at our Sim School of Business and president of the Beijing University Alumni Association. Please stand up. Yeshiva University is a Jewish university committed to our sacred ancient traditions. Yet since the day of its founding, YU has been outward-facing to engage with the world around us under the rubric of Torah U-Madda, Jewish and general learning. In the 21st century, the world has become smaller as global networks and connections abound. It's time to explore the Chinese and Jewish traditions comparatively. YU also has a growing population of Chinese students, especially at the Katz School of Science and Health. And a warm welcome to our Chinese students. 非常欢迎亲爱的中国学生们，很高兴你们参加我们的会议。There are two parts to the program this evening. I'll speak briefly myself about the Jewish tradition, our sacred classical texts, the Bible, the Talmud, and generations of commentaries. And next, Professor Ames will present his philosophical interpretation of the Confucian classics, and his interpretation is deeply influential in China today. One of my goals will be to frame Professor Ames' lecture so that the audience will appreciate his remarkable achievements in developing a world philosophy. Comparative study is difficult because people are generally comfortable and familiar with their own traditions. We face challenges with foreign traditions, different languages, cultures, and ways of thinking. That's precisely the challenge Professor Ames addresses in his philosophical interpretation of Confucius. Could I get that book a second? This is a book that was written about the philosophy of Professor Ames by leading Confucian scholars today. And it's not the only one. A number of studies have engaged with Professor Ames. And the title is here what I wanted to reference, Appreciating the Chinese Difference. Okay, we are different, we come from different perspectives. And this encapsulates Professor Ames' philosophy. In the spirit of Torah U-Madda, I'd say that the challenges of learning about a foreign tradition are worth facing because we gain so much by seeing our own world from new perspectives. And the audience today is a Chinese and Jewish audience, and that's the conversation that I'm talking about. And it's a blessing for us at YU to have a growing Chinese population. And I'd like to introduce one YU student from China who bravely faced the challenge of different cultures and endeavors to understand Jewish culture. Shangguan Shun is from Wuhan, China. She earned her BA in statistics from Zhongnan University of Economics and Law. She's now studying quantitative economics at YU's Katz School of Science and Health. I think it would be valuable for this audience to hear a few words from Shun about her experiences here.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Shun Shangguan. I am a graduate student from the Katz School in the Master of Quantitative Economics program. And the first thing I would like to say is thank you, not only because Professor Cohen has given me an extraordinary honor to speak with you tonight, but also because I have been given the opportunity to study at Yeshiva University. America's famous Jewish university has given me the opportunity to get the educational benefit and the experience about the Jewish culture and the American experience. So I'm originally from China, and when I graduated from college, I decided to pursue my studies in economics here in the United States. I still remember the first time I got into our university. I was shocked how special our university is. Lots of lovely girls with black skirts over knees, a few boys with hats overhead. And there were many mysterious symbols I didn't recognize. So with excitement and a nervous heart, I began my new life here. Today, as the Chinese-Jewish conversation continues, we are having the second lecture about Chinese philosophy. When I was in China, how lucky I was to receive enlightenment education from Professor Brian Zhang, who dedicates his life to Chinese students. In China, while exam-oriented education is the norm, Professor Zhang insists on teaching philosophy and liberal arts. I was always told that philosophy helps us live a better life. And when it concerns to Chinese philosophy like Confucianism, he emphasized that we should develop what is useful or healthy and discard which is not. And also, we should not ignore Western philosophy. His words just remind me of our university's motto, Torah and the secular knowledge. That means combining academic education with the study of the Torah. Since we international students have stepped out of our country, facing culture shock, on the one hand, we keep some of the traditional spirit, which is part of our blood. On the other hand, we can adapt Western philosophy into our lives. We get involved in different roles. We communicate and connect. Being in New York has taught me to be more tolerant, more open-minded, and accepting and respecting differences between people and cultures, and to be curious and respectful about people I meet. No matter where we are and wherever we're from, we all are facing a truly global society where different cultures concept in different ways. So I wish for all of us an intersection where there is no conflict, no discrimination, no killing, no war. We can choose to meet with love and respect. No man is an island, entire of itself. So that's why we have this Chinese-Jewish conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shun, for representing your class so eloquently. I wish my Chinese were 1/10 as good as your English. In Jewish tradition, we say that one learns the most from one's students. So I turned to Shun and her friends to help select my Chinese name, Kong Mu Ren, which derives from the Confucian value of benevolence, though Professor Ames will tell you that there's a better translation of that term, but that's for the lecture. As we mentioned in our inaugural lecture 1 month ago on a snowy Tuesday evening in February that some of you remember, I mentioned that the idea of a Chinese-Jewish conversation at YU began with a visit by Professor Yuda Fu in 2015. Professor Fu is the founding director of the Institute for Judaic and Interreligious Studies at Shandong University in China. And since his visit, I've been teaching a 2-week course annually in Jinan, China at Shandong University. During the lovely Shabbat that Professor Fu spent at our home, he explained what motivated him to learn about Judaism. He appreciated how the Jewish people applied their ancient traditions in the modern era in a way he found relevant for China. The Confucian texts have been the core of state-sponsored learning throughout China's 2,000-year dynastic history. But as China sought to modernize in the 20th century, these books, the classical Confucian texts, were put on the defense. Reformers and intellectuals, under pressure to transform China into a modern state, asked whether Confucian teachings were still relevant to their political and social reality. The Communist Revolution gave these questions an increasingly violent solution. Over the last generation, however, intellectual leaders are again turning to the Confucian texts as a source of genuine Chinese values. Yet the challenge remained how to make these texts relevant in the modern era. Professor Fu recognized that the Jewish people found a way to preserve their ancient heritage while engaging in the world around them. Like the Chinese, we as Jews venerate our classical ancient texts. Around the time that the 5 classics, the Wu Jing of the Confucian canon, crystallized, our Bible, the Tanakh, was canonized by Ezra HaSofer and the men of the Great Assembly, Anshe Knesset Hagdolah. But this was only the beginning of the story. Our rabbis engaged in midrashic interpretation of the Bible to produce the system of Jewish law and norms of behavior. The Bible is a closed text for us now, but the gates of interpretation were never closed, to borrow a term that our great sage Maimonides used in the 12th century. The sages of the Talmud, followed by the medieval interpreters known as the Rishonim, the early ones, sought to interpret the Word of God, both in its original sense and as a guide for contemporary life. And that's something that my students in my Bible course in Shir HaShirim hear quite often, and we welcome them this evening as well. It was during the medieval period that Jewish philosophy emerged out of an engagement with Greco-Arabic philosophy. While certain theological dogmas and doctrines are implicit in the Talmud and Midrash, systematic Jewish philosophy was pioneered by Saadia Gaon in the 10th century and refined by Maimonides in the 12th century. Those Rishonim both wrote in Arabic and interpreted Judaism in response to the Muslim cultural world around them. In the 20th century, Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, the towering intellectual figure of Yeshiva University, formulated a novel Jewish philosophy for modern times. Rabbi Soloveitchik was trained as a neo-Kantian and was influenced by a range of 19th and early 20th century German thinkers. His approach differed from Saadia Gaon and Maimonides, who interpreted Judaism using Greco-Arabic philosophical categories. Rabbi Soloveitchik, on the other hand, used his philosophical analytic training to define Judaism on its own terms, with the halakha, the Jewish law, being central. Consider the titles of his major philosophical works: Halachic Man, Halachic Mind. Yeshiva University stands for modern orthodoxy, the need we have as traditional Jews to engage with the world around us. We recognize that Judaism today isn't what it was 100 years ago, or 800 years ago in the time of Maimonides, or 2,000 years ago, 2,400 years ago in the time of Ezra HaSofer. But actually modern orthodoxy isn't modern at all, because this ability and necessity to adapt is built into our Jewish religious tradition. Jews are the people of the book, and so the core of this adaptation is a methodology of interpretation and reinterpretation of our classical texts. While the Word of God is finite, its interpretation is open. This is reflected in many sayings of the rabbis. For example, the notion that the Torah has 70 faces, 70 types of interpretation. While we must always remain faithful to our authoritative classical texts, it's incumbent upon us to find new meaning in them in each generation. It's precisely this balance that characterizes our academic Jewish studies as taught at the Bernard Revel Graduate School. Since I'm the associate dean of the school, it's my job to inform you about it and do some advertising. And some of the literature on your seats is about our school, and you should look into taking a course, taking a program. We have an auditing possibility as well, and undergraduates can also take courses for graduate credit in the Bible department, the Jewish history department, the philosophy department, and the Talmud department. Now, what's unique about Revel, as opposed to, say, a traditional yeshiva-type learning, we recognize the delineation of different time periods. We recognize that there's a difference between the ancient period and the medieval period and the modern period in philosophy and history, and the various layers of our development religiously, intellectually, and socially. And it's in this light that we can best appreciate the contributions to Confucian scholarship made by Professor Roger Ames. It's difficult to overstate his importance in the world of Chinese philosophy today. It will be a great lecture, but you're not just listening to an interesting lecture. This is a person who has changed the discourse of Chinese philosophy today. An energetic teacher for over 4 decades, Professor Ames has taught thousands of students, including many leading Confucian scholars today. The fact that he was invited to Beijing, despite being a foreigner, to teach Chinese people about their own heritage speaks volumes. There are already a number of studies devoted to his philosophy, and that book was only one example, meaning his interpretation of Confucian thought. Of course, Professor Ames has his critics. Not everybody accepts what he says, and he always says to me, it's good that we don't all agree. That way we have a real dialogue, a real discussion. No one can ignore his views, however, and all acknowledge that he has shaped the contours of modern Chinese philosophy. The volume I mentioned earlier offers the following assessment of our guest speaker this evening. Over the last 4 decades, no scholar of Chinese philosophy in the English-speaking world has had a greater impact than Roger T. Ames. In fact, one needs to step back considerably to appreciate the scale of Ames' impact on the field, far enough to consider it alongside the monumental achievements made in the 19th century when the Scottish missionary and sinologist James Legge defined his own epoch by first translating the Chinese classics into English. It would not be an exaggeration to say that in Chinese philosophy, Professor Ames is what we call, in Jewish tradition, a Gadol Hador, a giant of our generation, a term used about Rabbi Soloveitchik. On the one hand, Ames is a scholar who has mastered the ancient classics and their long interpretive tradition. The Jewish audience here is familiar with the different interpretive epochs in our tradition: the Talmud, the Rishonim of the medieval period, and the Achronim, the later ones of the early modern and modern periods. The Chinese classics likewise have long and complex interpretive traditions. Commentaries throughout the generations addressed influences of society, both internal and external. During the Song dynasty, from 960 to 1279, for example, Chinese intellectuals, under the influences of Buddhism and Taoism, gave new attention to metaphysical big questions that were not prominent in earlier Confucianism. In the 19th century, the Confucian texts were translated by missionaries who gave the Chinese concept Christian overtones. In the 20th century, many Confucian scholars, even Chinese scholars, interpreted the ancient texts in light of modern Western philosophy. Roger Ames, on the other hand, argues for giving the Chinese texts their own voice without appealing to Christian or even Western philosophical categories. Although an expert in Chinese philology and the history of Chinese interpretation, Professor Ames' goal is not simply to capture the original intention of the ancient texts. He strives to give them a new interpretation that has meaning for our lives in the 21st century. I promise the lecture you're about to hear will be riveting and may at times be challenging to grasp. But keep in mind that Professor Ames is a world philosopher and his ideas are worthy of further study. We'll hold all of the questions until the end. If you do have a question, please write it down clearly on one of the little pieces of paper provided, and our staff will collect them for Professor Ames to address at the end of the lecture. And now, without further ado, I'm honored to introduce Professor Roger Ames of Beijing University.
I must say that I have never had an introduction quite as moving as Mordecai's. Thank you very much. First, let me say that my email is here, and my students say that I check my email every 11 minutes. And so if you have a question or you have a comment, please feel free to contact me. There we go. I'm gonna skip ahead because I want to have some time to have a conversation. But we can say that we live in the best of times, we live in the worst of times. That we human beings are magnificent. We are at a point now where we have the science, we have the technology, so that we could claim that that hunger, world hunger, is no longer a problem. You don't have a problem if you have a solution. And we do have the solution. We could, if we had the political will, if we had the moral capacity, we could say today, let's get rid of world hunger, and we could achieve it. But at the same time, we live in the worst of times. That we have global warming, we have environmental degradation, we have food and water shortage. We have 8 people in the world who own half of the wealth of the human being. These equity, the inequities. So we have a predicament. Now, a predicament is different from problems in the sense that problems are solved. Predicaments need resolve. They need a change in values. They need a change in intentions. They need a change in practices. That human beings have to live in the world in a different way. This predicament has 4 conditions. Number 1, that the human being is integral to the predicament. That it's because of us that we have this problem. The second condition is there are no boundaries. Pandemics don't care if you're Jewish, if you're African, if you're Chinese, if you're Canadian, that it'll take your life. So there are no borders. The third thing is that these different kinds of problems are all organic. You can't solve one without addressing the others. And fourth, we as human beings have the cultural resources to stand up and address these problems. And so what I want to talk about is there is a religious scholar named James Carse, University of Indiana, and he gives us a very good distinction. He distinguishes between finite games and infinite games. 有限游戏, 无限游戏. And finite games are very familiar. Finite games are Roger and Mordecai, according to a finite set of rules, within a finite period of time, with a beginning and an end, playing to win. When we talk about games, finite games, games are things human beings do. We do business, we do education, we do international relations. And so games are the things that we do, sports. Games are things human beings do, and finite games is a model of winners and losers, single actors playing to win. And so when we think of these games that we do, we have this kind of a very familiar model. But 无限游戏, infinite games, are really something very different. Infinite games are me and my granddaughter, strengthening our relationships to help her address the pressing issues of the time, this increasingly complex world. There's no beginning, there's no end. If we need to change the rules, we change the rules. But the goal is winners and winners, or losers and losers. That we recognize, in order to be a great teacher, I have to have a great student, and the better the student, the better the teacher. That you have this kind of interdependence. And so the one thing I want to talk about that comes from the Chinese tradition, and tonight I'm going to speak about the Chinese tradition and not the Jewish tradition, because I want the Jewish people in the audience to listen, and you'll hear Judaism in the things that I have to say about China. You'll hear it much better than somebody like me can say it. And so this idea of moving from finite games to infinite games, these problems, global warming, China can't solve that problem. America can't solve that problem, but human beings together can solve the problem. Environmental degradation, China can't solve it, America can't. Together we can do it. So in our time, we have to go to our cultural resources and find the assets that are necessary to have a world that we can pass on to the next generation, to my granddaughter. My most recent stuff is called Confucian Role Ethics. And the real important idea here is the idea of a vocabulary. Confucian role ethics, a vocabulary. What am I talking about? I'm talking about a problem that we face today when it comes to understanding this long and rich Confucian tradition. That what we have done, the people who introduced China into the Western Academy were missionaries. And well-intended missionaries, but they had a mission, and that's why we call them missionaries. Their mission was to win the soul of China for the Christian religion. These were not evangelicals. These were people with Plato in one pocket and Aristotle in the other. This was the civilization of Europe that had come to China to try to change the civilization of China and bring it to within the European orbit. And what they did was they translated the Chinese tradition in a way that is very familiar to Western people, but very distant from the Chinese tradition itself. When you translate Tian as heaven with a capital H, when you translate Yi as righteousness, righteousness is comporting yourself according to the will of God. Righteousness is a biblical term. When you translate Li as ritual, And then what we have is we have a Confucianism that is really shaped in the model of Christianity. And if we need evidence for that, if you go to Barnes, I think the last Barnes & Noble bookstore is down near Union Square. You look for Chinese philosophy, and it's shelved under Eastern religions. You go to your library, and Chinese philosophy is not shelved in philosophy, it's shelved in BL, Eastern religions. And so what we've done is we've made this Confucian tradition into something very familiar to us. Capital H, heaven, gives us a concept of God, where in the Chinese tradition, this is a tradition without a notion of a transcendent God. It's a different way of being religious, not a way that is familiar to us. When James Legge, this great Oxford scholar, translated China into the Western Academy, he used the vocabulary of Joseph Butler, a theologian who had lived, an anti-Hobbesian theologian who wanted to celebrate the kindness, the beauty of the human spirit. And so Legge is taught, Mengzi, 那个人心的概念 is as nearly possible identical with that of Bishop Butler. It is much to be wished that instead of the term Tian, vague and indefinite, Mengzi had simply said God. So what he was doing, he was translating China into something that is familiar to Western religiousness. When you translate Tao as the way with a capital W, the first thing that comes into a Christian mind is I am the way, the truth, and the life. This is not Confucianism. When we let the tradition speak on its own terms, when we give it its own vocabulary, we look at the term Dao. Dao is written with the human being in the center. This is a human head. Dao is written with the human head. When we look at the term De, Dao, De, again, you have the human head, you have the human heart. The way is not his way. The way is the human way together. Ren nang hong dao, fei dao hong ren. That the human being extends the way. It's not the way that extends the human being. Dao, xingzhi er cheng. That Dao is made in the walking. Ben li er dao xiang. That you set the root and Dao grows therefrom. That in this Confucian tradition, each generation has the capacity, has the responsibility to build the connector into the next generation. That way is not something that is God gives to the human being and the human being walks the way. Way is something that the human being has to participate in extending for his or her own time and place. But the Christianization of Confucianism is a Western problem. Is Lao Wai's problem, but Lao Zhong also has their problem. That what happened in the second half of the 19th century was Western learning, Western education was brought wholesale into East Asia. We just celebrated at Beida, the 120th anniversary of Beida. Beida isn't 120 years old. Beida is the Guozijian. Beida is the Taixue. Beida is a university that goes back thousands of years and is continuous, but 120 years is when Western education was brought into China. I teach in the philosophy department. 哲学 isn't Chinese. That's an invention. That's 形而上学. That's not Chinese. 伦理学, that's not Chinese. 逻辑, that's not Chinese. That the whole vocabulary of my discipline at Peking University is a Western vocabulary, and that's the same in sociology and law, in all of these, that what we have done is we use Western concepts, Western theory, to understand the Chinese experience. And so the problem of understanding this Confucian tradition is a shared problem between modern Chinese who are educated within a lung, within a conceptual structure that belongs to the West, and a Western tradition that is understanding China as a kind of aberrant Christianity. When we translate E as righteousness, to comport yourself according to the will of God, we have to understand that the best translators of the Chinese tradition, Marcel Grenet is the most distinguished French sinologist of the 20th century, and he says it very clearly. 中华智慧不需要上帝的理念, the 概念. That Chinese wisdom has no need for this idea of God. Tang Juni, one of the most distinguished contemporary philosophers, Chinese people have not embraced the concept of a transcendent God. My teacher at the University of London, Angus Graham, in the Chinese cosmos, all things are interdependent without transcendent principles. That it exposes a preconception of Western interpreters that such concepts as Tian, translated heaven, or Tao, translated as way, must have the transcendence of our own ultimate principle. It is hard for us to grasp that even the way is interdependent with human beings. That way is something that we participate in constructing, not something that comes to us from a second world. Joseph Needham, the great Cambridge Don, Chinese ideals involve neither God nor law. And so when we push this kind of a conversation between Judaism and Confucianism, what we have to understand is these traditions, you'll see immediate resonance, but there is a very important difference. And it's difference, activating difference, that produces diversity, that produces new meaning. It's when difference makes a difference that we are able to move ahead, to learn new things. And so let's understand that these are not the same world, they're importantly different, but that the conversation will be robust because of those differences. Tang Juni, one of my teachers also in Hong Kong, when Chinese philosophers speak of the world, they are speaking of the world in which we live. There's no second world. There's no world outside there. It's 自然而然. That in the minds of Chinese people, the cosmos has always been nothing more than a continuous stream. If the classical Greeks are metaphysicians, if there's a science of first principles, if there is a structure that comes to the world from outside, a second world, in the Chinese world, there's the I Ching. There's the I Ching Da Zhuan that makes explicit the cosmology, the process Shang Shang Bu Xi, the process cosmology of the Chinese tradition. And so beyond this process, there is not some other fixed substratum that supports it. So when we ask the question, what is Confucianism? What we have to understand is that the word Confucianism itself was invented by the second governor of Hong Kong in 1836 when he writes a book called Confucianism. If we translate Confucianism into Chinese, it's something like Kongzi Juyi, like Makasa Juyi, Hagar Juyi, that it becomes a kind of doctrine. It becomes maybe a dogma. But Confucianism is Ru Xue. If we speak this tradition on its own terms, use its own language, Ru Xue is not 孔子主义. 儒学 is a social class. The Ru people are the people who did the bronzes. It goes back to the Shang dynasty, that in the Shang dynasty, a group of people came forward and began this process of aestheticizing the human experience, lifting the human experience out of our animality and making it into something that is elegant, something that is refined, something that is enchanted. And so the bronzes are really, we could use the bronzes as a way of telling the story of the Chinese tradition. That it begins in the Shang dynasty 30 generations before Confucius, and it comes down generation after generation down to our contemporary time. And the first time that we see this term Ru, speaking Chinese, the first time that we see Confucianism, what we translate as Confucianism, is in the Analects, where you want to be an exemplary Ru, not a Shaoren Ru, not a small person Ru. It's a tradition that has this huge investment in the past. Confucius says of himself, 修而不作. I'm somebody who transmits the culture. I'm not somebody who's inventing it. And so it's very conservative as a tradition. It says that the culture that we inherit from the past is precious, and we have to make sure that we carry it on from generation to generation. But at the same time, it's a critical tradition. 如之何, 如之何. That when we ask the question, when we aspire to be moral, that in every situation we have to ask the question, what to do, 应该怎么做? What are we supposed to do in this situation? We have to, if we follow the Confucian idea of 修, to put yourself, 修道, put yourself in the 修中之道. You put yourself in the other person's place, and then you try to find the way of moving forward that grows the relationship in the most dramatic way. That morality in this Confucian tradition is not following some rules that we have received from something outside. Morality in this tradition is comporting yourself in such a way that you're growing your relationships in family, in community. And it's also a progressive tradition. 温故而知新, that what we do is you rehearse the past in order to move into the future. And so when we think about this concept of Ru, it is the intergenerational transmission and embodiment of a compounding cultural legacy that is very much focused on the idea of family. That the governing metaphor of this Confucian tradition is jia. If I speak Chinese, I speak English, I say, everybody please stand up. Everyone, please stand up. That body, one, goes back to Aristotle, goes back to Pythagoras, the idea of the immortal soul. If we speak Chinese, I would say, 大家请站起来. Big family, please stand up, because in a classroom, 师父, or maybe 师爷, 师公, grandpa teacher. And then we have 学妹 and 学兄. Student older brother and student younger sister. That in a Chinese world, we don't have a country, we have a 国家, a country family. As human beings, we're not ren, we're renjia, we're a human family. The idea of family is the governing metaphor of the tradition. And so we look at the main values, and they center on this thing called family. And so today, in the short time that I have to be with you, I want to make sure that I save time for our conversation. What I want to do is I want to focus on two ways in which this concept of family is defining of the Confucian tradition. First, for the for the population as a whole, you have the notion of shell. In English, we translate it as filial piety. But then our students say to us, I don't know what you're talking about. You might as well just use shell, because I don't know what filial piety means. But filial piety is this idea of intergenerational transmission. That if we go back to the earliest Chinese writing, the Jia Gu Wen, the writing that is found on the bones of oxen, and this writing system goes back to the Shang Dynasty, and in the Shang Dynasty you already have a vocabulary of 5,000 characters. An educated person in China can read maybe 3,500 characters. A person who graduates from Beida, from Beijing University, can recognize maybe 4,000 characters because they're special. But at this time, you already have a vocabulary of 5,000 characters, and so this is a very sophisticated culture. On the oracle bones, the character shell is the combination of the older generation and the younger generation. And so on the oracle bones, the character for Lao, for old person, the character kind of reminds you of that famous picture of Einstein, where he's got the crazy hair, and he's leaning on a walking cane. But when we have the character for Xiao, no longer is it a walking cane, it's the next generation. And so Xiao is the way in which we move from generation to generation. The older generation receives reverence from the younger generation. The younger generation receives delight because they are who they are because of the older generation. The values are transmitted from generation to generation. And so in this classic of family reverence, this Xiao Jing, it says, your physical person with its hair and skin is received from your parents. Vigilance and not allowing anything to do injury to your person is where family reverence begins. But the idea of not doing, of preserving your body is not a simple idea. There's the physical body, but there's the concept of embodiment. That each generation, when you look at the picture of your grandmother, she was wearing a funny hat, and it's an old picture, a yellow picture, but you see the physical similarities, but the physical similarities are surface. It's the values, it's the language, it's the food, it's the songs, it's the poetry of the generation, each generation that is transmitted, embodied. And so keeping your body whole is not simply keeping your physical body whole, it's keeping the cultural body intact. So the body is the site of a conveyance of the cultural corpus of knowledge from one generation to the next. This is what is most significant. When we look at the Analects of Confucius, Confucius has been on the road. Confucius lives a life in the state of Lu. He gets to be about 50 years old, and he really feels as though he's not accomplished anything. And so he's not taken seriously in his own home state. And so he goes on the road, and he travels to the state of Chu, near Wuhan, the state of Chu, and somebody says to Confucius, if you're nani boo boo, if you're so smart, why aren't you in government? And Confucius says, the Book of Documents says, it is all in family reverence. Just being reverent to your parents and a friend to your brothers is carrying out the work of governing. In doing this, I am employed in governing. Why must I be employed in government? That governing in the Chinese tradition begins in the family. That Yan Fu, the great translator of Western classics, he translates John Stuart Mill on liberty. He translates Huxley, the idea of evolution. When he looks back on 2,000 years of Chinese imperial history, Yan Fu says, if you want to talk about political order, if you want to talk about social order, it is 30% government, it is 70% family lineage, jiazu, shizu, that its family is where order comes from. And I would say that is as true today as it was then. That order is not somebody imposing order on the people. Order is governance orchestrating certain values in the culture. When another passage from the Analects, Master Yo said, 立志用和为贵, that an optimizing superlative harmony is the most valuable function of aspiring to propriety in one's roles and relationships. In the ways of the former kings, this optimization of harmony by aspiring to such propriety made them refined. It was a guiding standard in all things large and small. But when things are not going well, to pursue harmony just for its own sake, without regulating the situation through family, through Li, will not work. That family is where He, where harmony is to be pursued. Now, this idea of He is really very important. Again, if we look on the Jiaguwen, if we look on these ancient Chinese characters, He has to do with music. It has to do with He. It has to do with food. That He is not, to translate it simply as harmony, is insufficient. Harmony is ratio. But this kind of harmony is ratio and or ratio. That it's an optimizing symbiosis. It's trying to get the most out of your ingredients. The strategy, the idea of using family as the governing metaphor is really very productive. Like, you're at Yeshiva University. If your family says, Shun, we need you, somebody's ill, then you have to say to your teacher, excuse me, I have to take a leave. I have to go home. They need my time. They need my money. They need my kidney, that it's time to go home. That family is the metaphor where families are a pain in the butt. But families are the most important thing in our lives. And so the family as a governing metaphor, in the Han Dynasty, Wang Chong says that the most sagacious among us want to family the world. Yao jia tianxia, want to family the world. That if you can family the world, then you are, and so you have this idea of 修身, 齐家, 治国平天下, that you have to go through family in order to get to 平天下, in order to get to bringing peace to the world. And so when we think of this idea of He, of optimizing symbiosis, one way to think about it is the Chinese menu. You go into a Chinese restaurant, and it's not a German menu where you have food on one side, food on the other side, and drinks on the back. When you go into a Chinese menu, it's page after page of stuff. And this is a Chongqing restaurant. If you go next door to a Lanzhou restaurant, it's another book. And if you go next door to a Guangdong restaurant, it's another book. That Chinese restaurants are always about a certain place in China, the food that belongs to a certain place. But in each case, it's this idea of taking a finite number of ingredients and trying to optimize. And so what you do, think of Chinese cooking. you take the cheapest thing, cai, vegetables, and you cut it up in pieces in order to create the greatest surface area, the minimum expenditure of fuel, and then you take the most expensive thing, a little bit of meat, and you put it onto the vegetable. And then when you're eating it, you use rice or noodles or bing, some kind of bread to eat it. And then when you go, you don't go to a Chinese restaurant by yourself. Nobody goes to a Chinese restaurant by themselves. You have to say, Mordecai, let's do Chinese. And then you put all the dishes in the middle, and so everybody gets a little bit of a lot. That the idea of the Chinese menu is optimizing the ingredients. And Chinese people eat really weird stuff, But what you do is you keep the garbage can empty. You find a way to use everything. And so the idea of optimizing symbiosis is food. You take something like Sun Tzu Bingfa, the art of warfare. The art of warfare in China is not how to win the war. The art of warfare is buda-yi, is you only go to war if you absolutely have to, if you have no choice, and then you know it's a losing proposition. So even when you do war is how do we get out of this mess losing as little as possible? A different way. It's not about heroics. It's not about honor. It's not about. It's about having a bad day and getting past the bad day and getting back to where we want to be. So what you have in this tradition is, instead of the kind of teleology that becomes common sense coming out of the Greek tradition, I always ask my students, I say, what does an acorn become? And the smart student will say, an oak tree. I say, what does a chicken egg become? And they say, a chicken. And I say, no. That 1 in a million acorns becomes an oak tree, most of them become squirrels. 1 in a million eggs becomes a chicken, most of them become breakfast, That teleology, the idea that something becomes what it should be, is not part of the Chinese tradition. Instead, you have this idea of zhonghe, that we're not going anywhere. We didn't come from somewhere. We have a cultural tradition, but there's no end game. It's just, how do we, with this particular group of people in this particular time, get the most out of the human experience? We're not going to heaven. We're not going to somewhere else. This life here is not an effort on behalf of something that is higher and more noble. This is the life, and so how can we make the most of it? And of course, is there another life? Yes, there is another life. That this young lady, when she looks at the picture of her grandmother lives on in her. That each generation lives on in the generations that come after. You have a surname and you have a given name. The surname is the family lineage. It goes from century to century, passed on, and then your job is to make the family famous, is to lift the name of the family and make it distinguished. If you're good at business, then everybody should drive a Bauma. Everybody should drive a BMW. If you're great at music, then everybody should know your name. If you're a great scholar, then you should be teaching the next generation. That the idea is, again, the responsibility of each generation as they carry on the tradition where ancestors live on in each generation. Emerson gives us this wonderful image. Emerson says, you see a carpenter standing on a ladder with a broadaxe, chipping away at the wood on the ceiling. How awkward, how inefficient it is. But if the carpenter puts the piece of wood on the ground and brings the axe over to chop the wood, then the whole of the cosmos comes behind his shoulders. That when you try to live a life as a human being by yourself and just do what you can do by yourself, it's very awkward, it's very inefficient. But if you have civilization behind you, generation after generation, then you can explode the stick, that the whole of the cosmos comes behind your shoulders. And so for our time, the most important contribution that this Confucian tradition has to make, like, I'm not a naive person. I'm not a nativist. There's lots of things to criticize in Confucianism, but Confucianism also has its contribution to make. And so my argument would be that in this time, if we want to move from finite games to infinite games, if we want to move from a model of winners and losers to winners and winners, this Confucian tradition has its wisdom. 己有利而利人. That the only way that you can get ahead yourself is by helping other people to get ahead. That if your neighbor does better, you do better. This is the wisdom of the Chinese tradition, grounded in the concept of a family. That every member of the family has to make a contribution to the family, and by virtue of that contribution, the family flourishes. Everybody wins together. And so when we try to take this tradition on its own terms, when we don't Christianize it, when we don't use the Western vocabulary of modernity to interpret the Confucian tradition, it offers us a different concept of person. And let me just finish with this image. Chinese medicine is a very useful way to think about the Chinese tradition, because Chinese medicine is a practical application of the cosmology that we find in the I Ching, that we find that grounds not simply the Confucian tradition, but the Taoist tradition and Chinese Buddhism as well. That underlying these Sanjiao Wei, the three traditions as one, what makes them one is a shared cosmology. And we can use the idea of the heart-mind. The idea, we can use this as a metonym, as a symbol of what it means to be a person. That my heart-mind in Chinese medicine is here. If I take it out of its context, it's a dead piece of meat. If it's in the body and it's functioning properly, when the doctor listens to my body, he or she is listening to the way in which the different parts of the body are interacting. If it's not obstructed, if it's not too hot or not too cold, then the body is functioning properly. But in order for the heart-mind to function properly, it needs the sunshine, it needs air, it needs nourishment. And so the heart-mind is not a thing. The heart-mind is a center of activity. And physiologically, it can only function when all of the different relationships that locate it as a center are functioning properly. But in the Chinese tradition, the heart-mind is also thinking and feeling. And so if in my relationships with other people, it's not too hot and not too cold, if there's no obstruction, then I'm living productively with the people in my world. And so when we think of the concept of person in this tradition, it's holistic. That the whole cosmos is here in any one person. That we need the whole of the cosmos to explain one person. It's processual. That a human being is not a human being, it's a human becoming. We are what we do. That in this tradition, we need the idea of process, that a human is something that we do. It is fundamentally relational, that human beings are 关系构成的, that human beings are constituted by their roles and their relationships. If you take away the roles and relationships, it's an onion. There's nothing there. That the individuality of a person is an achievement that is attained. The individuality is not exclusive of other people. It's by virtue of the relationships that you've cultivated with other people that makes you distinguished as a human being. So individuality is not a starting point, it's an achievement. And so in a world, like Aristotle gave us a world of things, that we were noun-centered in our thinking. In this Chinese world, a human being is an event in history. A human being is a narrative. That a human being is not something that you can isolate and know. You have to know, where does she come from? 她的老家, what is her hometown? Who are her teachers? What is her path? In this world, you have to 知道. You have to know the road. You have to know the narrative of where she came from. And so the idea of the gerund, the idea of the human becoming, is really fundamental. So let me just finish on this. That in this Confucian role ethics, the alternative to this infinite games, that is the alternative to individualism, to winners and losers, you have relationally constituted gerundive concept of person. You have the idea of achieving personal identity through embodiment, through living your roles and relationships, li and ti, these two cognate ideas. That it's not rationality that enables you to find the best way forward. Rationality is one element in it. We need reason, but we also need our feelings. We need our bodies. And so it's imagination, shu, to put yourself in somebody else's position and try to figure out what is the best way to grow this relationship. And then finally, and this is very interesting when you talk about Judaism and Confucianism, you have a kind of atheistic religiousness. You have a family-centered religiousness. When the word religion in Latin is religare, it means to 绑得很紧, means to bind tightly. To bind tightly, if you have a transcendent God, means to get close to God, to be godly. But binding tightly in the Confucian tradition is li. It's when you, at Chunjie, at Chinese New Year, when people, the whole country, leaves the city and goes home. I mean, it's a mass migration of 1.4 billion people. I can drive a car in Beijing at Chinese New Year without fear, because everybody's gone home. And day number 1, 初一, 初二, day number 2, day number 15, what people are doing is they're eating the food, they're cultivating the relationships with family, they're breathing the air of their laojia, they're speaking their fengyan, the accent that you have in any particular place, and then you can go back to Beijing and live for another year because you've reconstituted yourself as a person. This is a 宗教感. This is a Confucius religiousness or religiosity that it doesn't have a God, but it has a family-centered kind of religiousness where you need a Chinese vocabulary to express it. You can't use the vocabulary of Western religion to talk about China. You need a Chinese vocabulary. And so my story tonight is, we have to let this Confucian tradition speak on its own terms, have its own voice, in order to appreciate the contribution it has to make to the modern world. Thank you very much. Sure.
Thank you very much, Professor Ames. Here's what we're going to be doing. Let me say the following. At this point, if you do have questions, we do have these little cards and actually our graduate school's pen. You can take this home. Bernard Revel Graduate School. You can write down any questions that you have. We're going to take a break in a moment for a few minutes if people need to stand. My daughter bought me this watch, this Apple Watch for my birthday, and it says every 45 minutes it's time to stand. So we're going to take a break, and my undergraduate students, what they once told me is, Professor, my favorite part of your class is the break. But I do ask that you do write these questions down if you're interested, because Professor Ames is interested in engaging in conversation. So Rona is in the back there. She's going to, if you have any questions, hold up your little card, and Professor Ames is going to, Rona's going to bring them to Professor Ames to read for a few moments, and he's going to decide in what order he's going to answer them. But what I just wanted to end off with is the idea of translation is extremely important. And this is something that I remember when I first heard your lecture in Tel Aviv some time ago now, over a year ago. I was immediately taken by a lot of what you said, and my son was accompanying me then. He was at that time a junior at the University of Virginia and had just gone to Shanghai to study Chinese. He and I both came away with the same idea, the notion that translating a culture, you have to be sensitive to the resonance of the terms and the baggage that the terms bring with them. Now, we're very sensitive as Jews to this because the Jewish people here in this audience are either bilingual or trilingual at different levels of proficiency, but we're all English speakers. But then there's our ancient language is Hebrew, but there's also the Yiddish language that Jews of Eastern Europe came with. And each language has its own tones and its own connotations. And so translating is not easy to do. And so we're very sensitive to the richness of that cultural encounter. All right, so my watch is telling me it's time for everybody to stand up and we'll reconvene in about 5 minutes, give Professor Ames a little bit of time to read the questions. Those of you who would like can remain, and we will have our discussion.
The mic wasn't on. Now it's good. So the first question, with all the good of emphasizing family in mind, how do you balance the unavoidable conservativeness that might hinder the progress of a country, the human mind? And that's true with any traditional culture. That the culture is both a resource and a source of conservatism. And so that's to find the proper balance, like what we need in the world. If Confucianism is going to make a contribution, we need a progressive Confucianism. We need an evolutionary Confucianism. We need a Confucianism that steps up to contemporary problems and addresses them. And one of the most fundamental problems is gender. So there's a couple of questions about gender. At Beida, on the 31st, they asked me to moderate a panel on gender and Confucianism. And so the two people that they invited, one of them was my PhD student. She wrote a book called Confucianism and Women. And then the second one is a man named Li Chen-yang, who's an old friend also from Beida, who wrote a book on gender. And so one of the issues that we have in the contemporary world today is gender discrimination, you know. And if Confucianism can't speak to that, then it's less than it is. What we learn from Confucianism with respect to gender is that human beings gender themselves in different ways. That and if that's the case, then we can understand gender as importantly a social construction, as well as something that has to do with reproduction and other things. And so what we learn from the Chinese experience and the fact that European gendering and Confucian gendering are different is to what extent convention, customs are instrumental in creating us in one way or another. But the important thing is that conservatism, to make sure that you understand, like when one generation inherits the tradition, they have to understand it. They have to expand upon it. They have to use it to address the pressing issues of their time, like gender discrimination, and when their hair turns white, then they have to pass it on to the next generation and recommend that they carry on. And so the answer about conservatism is, yes, be conservative. Make sure that you preserve the tradition, but at the same time, you have to adapt the tradition to our own time and our own place. It has to be useful. 知行合一, the inseparability of knowing and doing, you know. So that was a very important question. How did the one-child family policy affect Chinese culture? Like for one of the things that we don't understand with the Chinese tradition is that from the classical period, from the beginning, say from the Han Dynasty through the Ming Dynasty, the population of China was consistently somewhere between 40 and 60 million people. For that period of time. It's only in the Qing Dynasty that you really start to have a population explosion. At the beginning of the 20th century, the population of China is somewhere around 400 million people. And so this idea of 1.4 billion people is a very recent kind of situation. Now, I think most of the people that I know in China understand why there had to be a one-child policy. Like a one-child policy is not a good thing. Nobody wants that, but unless the issue of population is brought under control, then it's very difficult to shape a future for China. Nowadays, it has really become, people have become so comfortable with the idea of one child, that now that they've taken the one-child policy away, young Chinese people don't want to have more than one child. One very important byproduct of the one-child policy is that a woman is as precious as a female child is as precious as a male child. That this discrimination, this problem of favoring the male child is something that certainly persists. I'm not saying that it's not still there, but when you have only one child, that one child becomes very special to you, and the idea that it has to be a boy as opposed to a girl is being challenged by by that policy. So in our contemporary world, that policy has been drawn back, but people are not having more children. Affluence, having more children is, people are busy. People have things that they want to do. And so to have 6 children is no longer sort of a model of family. The second thing too, another question, was about family in the imperial times. You have this notion of 大家. You have the idea that in one household you have 3 generations. You have the grandparents and the parents and the children. But what about now? Like, what about the Chinese family today? But what happens in the Chinese world that is very interesting is family values are redistributed. Like, I'm in a philosophy department, and the relationship that you have between teachers and students is a family kind of a relationship. It's a family feeling. A classroom is a family. In my department, you have more senior professors and more junior professors. You have uncles that try to help people. And so these kinds of family feelings in a business, that the sense of family is redistributed in this new configuration of humanity where the big family has been left behind. My point is that this impulse, this family impulse, is very strong and persistent. I've never done this way of doing questions before, Mordecai. Well, here's another one. In the spirit of contemporary relevance, what happens when you have an abusive family? What happens when you have a mental illness, or you have a family that is violent? Is it right for me to break away from my family and make a new, normal, healthy life on my own? In the tradition, the ultimate standard that always has to be applied is the notion of E. E is not righteousness. It's not comporting yourself according to the will of God. E is finding what is most appropriate for everybody's interests in a particular situation. And so this notion of E has got to be the standard. If a person has an abusive family situation, then usually the pattern is that person will look for familial relationships outside, maybe with a teacher, maybe with an uncle or an auntie, abusive families, abusive parents. This is a reality, but the Confucian tradition and the commitment to family is preemptive in the sense that if you make family so important, then in some degree you're able to preempt abusive behavior. You're able to keep that out in some important degree. One of the things that we were talking about earlier was that, and maybe a way to make that same point, is I've been in China. The first time I went to Beijing was 1985. So that's a generation ago. And at that time, Chinese people were very poor. I remember going in Shandong. You had garlic and bing, and that's all. Men and women wore the same clothes. There was no color in China. It was really very, very poor. In one generation, you have this new China. But as I was there through this period of time, one thing that I never felt was physically threatened. Like, I'm Lao Wai, and in my pocket, in my wallet, in the old days, people know that you have half a year's salary in your pocket. But I never felt threatened. When Bonnie and I were teaching, our young son, 13, 14 years old, would go out with friends and come back at 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock at night, and you don't worry, that there's something very safe about China. And it really has to do with that kind of preemptive. If you can create a family fabric, a strong family fabric, then it brings a kind of stability. It brings a kind of safety to the community. And so, right now, living in China is probably the safest place in the world. We're staying in Beijing. Okay. Oh no. Okay. Okay. Good. And so, my final question. Get my glasses. Confucianism is so fundamental to China. How was Chairman Mao allowed to cast it into the dustbin? Okay. Very nice question. And that is that Chairman Mao tried, but he failed. What happened in the Chinese in the Chinese tradition is you had a Maoist era. I think people in China, and we all have different politics on this, and so I'm going to share my politics, but I would say that most people in China that I know would say that Mao Zedong was 65-35. 35 was the great leaps forward where millions of people died of starvation and so on, that Mao Zedong wreaked havoc in some ways on China. This we know, this is a fact. On the other hand, before the Maoist era, China was being torn apart by imperialism, by regionalism, by warlords, and so on. That somehow or other, with the Maoist period, with the founding of the Republic of China, you had China brought together in some important way. I mean, a way of thinking about it is that could you have this new China without having passed through that kind of a Maoist era? Would that have been possible? But I think the most important point is that the Cultural Revolution, 文化大革命, was 10 years of national insanity when the whole of the values were turned upside down, where students taught teachers, where universities, education, what is most important in the Chinese world, was closed down, and young people were sent to the countryside. I mean, it was a crazy period, but as he did, Confucius is back. That today in China you have 国学院. You know, that every major university has a university to study the Confucian culture. Abroad, you have 孔子学院, you know, that you have this idea of taking the Chinese voice to the world. And all of the problems that come with that. With the 孔子学院is a wonderful structure. The Confucius Institutes, 550 of them around the world. This is really an important structure. What we have to do with these Confucius Institutes is we have to strengthen the cultural component. That you know, there was a strategy, and that is initially they're teaching language. You know, they're not teaching culture, just language. And that is a way of establishing. People want to learn language. Now is the time when those same Confucius Institutes really have to be a source. We have to put 国学院 and 孔子学院 together. We have to take the young people who are learning the Chinese culture, the texts, and put them into institutions so that they can enable the rest of the world to understand China better. That there's an asymmetry in the understanding between China and the West. In America today, you have 350,000 Chinese students in America. 350,000. In China, you have 15,000 American students. 350,000, 15,000. And so there's this asymmetry, that China knows the West much better than the West knows China. And so what we need to do is we need to use the 孔子学院 as a way to 把孔子的文化走出去, you know. Okay, thank you very much.